C'était à cette période-là,
It was during this period, the beginning of the 1960s, that there was militant Quebec nationalism that even led to explosive attacks in the streets. We saw the emergence of an extremist group, the Quebec Liberation Front was its name. These explosions were the tangible reaction to linguistic discrimination. The French-speaking Canadians were largely excluded from high-level posts in the public and private sectors, the Army, federal government, and the majority of the other
And it was really in response to those political, social, cultural tensions in the 1960s that the Official Languages Act was adopted in 1969. It opened the doors of the public service to French-speaking Canadians, guaranteeing a certain level of service in both official languages and giving an official status to French and English. It was also involved the creation of the job that I now hold, Commissioner of Official Languages. I am the 6th Commissioner. And it's worth noting that I'm an officer of Parliament. My name was proposed by the government, but I had to be voted on by both houses of Parliament. I have a 7-year mandate, and it takes a vote of 2 houses of Parliament to fire me. So I have a degree of independence, a bit like the Auditor General, an arm's length relationship from the government of the day. And the Act, followed by constitutional language protection in the 1982 Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is based on 2 fundamental rights, the right to learn and the right to use. And similarly, it has 2 fundamental purposes: to protect minority language communities and to ensure that the 4 million unilingual French-speaking Canadians get the same level of service from the federal government as the 20 million unilingual English-speaking Canadians. At first, much of English Canada contested the Act, especially the hiring of numerous French-speaking Quebecers within the public service. The Act was also not enough to end violent conflict. October 1970 became known in Canadian history as the October Crisis. It involved a kidnapping of a Quebec Minister of Labour and a British diplomat, James Cross. Mr. Cross was freed. Minister Laporte was murdered. That was, however, the last act of violence in the crisis. And by the time I arrived in Montreal as a correspondent for Maclean's magazine in 1976, the province was about to elect its first provincial government formed by a sovereignist party. Its goal was to take Quebec out of Canada, a quest that's remained unsuccessful even after 2 referenda, one in 1980 and one in 1995. La Charte canadienne des droits et libertés de 1982.
The Canadian Charter of Rights and Liberties tried to, at least in part, respond to the aspirations of the Quebec Francophones and those in the rest of France, guaranteeing, for example, schools for the linguistic minorities throughout the country. French teaching had been discouraged prior to that, and even prohibited in some provinces. The Charter looked at considering as official language. Linguistic duality in Canada supposed that the status of official language should be protected throughout Canadian territory, not just in Quebec. One of the links to the linguistic reality in Canada is to not have.
We based our experience in part on Finland as a kind of compromise between a purely territorial system and a purely individual system, and there is this careful mix. Changes to the 1988 Official Languages Act were consistent with this generally non-territorial approach, although some of the new dispositions took demography into account. More specifically, the changes brought new language obligations with regard to Parliament, federal courts, services from the federal government, language of work within much of the federal public service, and equality in hiring and advancement opportunities. What has happened since then is just 3 years ago, the Act was amended again for only the 2nd time, giving legal teeth to Part 7 of the Act, which requires the government to take positive measures for the growth and development of English language minorities, which is intriguing in a number of ways. Not often do governments have that kind of far-reaching obligation that can be legally enforced to take positive measures, and also positive measures which have not been defined in legislation. And the other interesting thing was that it was the result of a private member's bill. No government brought this forward. It was imposed by Parliament on government. We haven't yet had the rendezvous with the courts that I expect that will define what the scope is of that definition of positive measures, but it's, we've already been to the courts to protect the court challenges program, which had been cancelled by the government, resulting in a settlement outside of court, an out-of-court settlement. But it is an indication, if you like, of the vitality of the conversation that happens in Canada between French language the minority and majority Canadian populations, Parliament, and the courts. It's this ongoing triangular conversation that has resulted in language policy being a continuing advancing issue to ensure not only the strength of the French language as a national language, an official language in Canada, but also the growth and development of minority communities, French-speaking communities outside Quebec and English communities in Quebec. To cut ahead, one of the continuing challenges we have is that despite 40 years, next year it'll be the 40th anniversary of the Act, much of the purposes and elements of the Act remain misunderstood. Now, there are some positive elements to that. It's no longer the hot button issue it was. When I bring out an annual report, it's not automatically front page news. And that's partly because Canadians are generally in favor. We have 80% support for official bilingualism across the country. And let me tell you, that was far from the case 40 years ago. But as Dr. Victor Goldblum, one of my predecessors, put it back in 1992, there is an urgent need for the federal government itself to do more to explain in plain English or in plain French what linguistic duality is all about. People cannot be expected to support what they do not understand. When will we be able to say that linguistic duality is firmly entrenched in Canadian society? The ultimate challenge is to nurture a culture of leadership in both official languages. To understand the whole country, our political leaders, leading business people, journalists, ambassadors, and top athletes should have a good understanding of both English and French. To effectively deliver their message to the whole country, they must be able to communicate in both languages. There's no way around it. But leadership must also be present at every level of an organization. It must manifest itself through willingness to learn the other official language and through openness toward the different cultures that make up the Canadian fabric.
And there's one other thing that I have been able to observe, and that's to say that the cultural diversity on the one hand and linguistic diversity, the conflict is not really there. It's a false conflict. Many who come to Canada want to become bilingual more often than the Canadians that have been in Canada for quite some time. It's a matter of identity.
In Canadian official languages policy and law, a values-driven approach is essential. Such policies cannot settle all conflicts or solve all problems. One might ask, why bother? Why protect linguistic minorities if it can't solve all the problems? I've devoted a significant part of my career to understanding Canada's official languages policy and how it applies to both English and French minority communities throughout the country. I can say, without a doubt, that languages matter. Because in Canada, our two official languages are an assertion and an expression of our country's identity in all its diversity. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Fraser.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fraser.